This is a 29-gallon tank and there are 22 tiger barbs in it. I'm using 2 sponge filters, one large and one small. I prefer to hide my sponge filters behind plants in order to keep the tank more natural looking. The heater is also hidden in the back and I keep the temperature at 78 degrees Fahrenheit or 26 degrees Celsius. I change 5 gallons of water per week. I don't use CO2 or fertilizers. The tiger barbs are the only fish in this tank, and in my opinion, that's the easiest way to keep this species without any trouble. Because, as I mentioned in a previous video, these adorable little fish have a nasty habit of continuously pestering other fish, especially the weak, the slow, the sick, or anything with long fins. So, tiger barbs are not a good choice for the typical community tank, and I prefer to keep mine in a single species setup such as the one seen here. The plants in this tank are as follows. And just because there's only one type of fish in this aquarium, it does not mean that it's boring by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, my tiger barb tank is probably one of the most entertaining aquariums in my whole collection. Because these little fish are super active and curious, and they're very fast, which is especially true when it's time to eat, because tiger barbs have a big appetite, and they eat like a group of hungry piranha. In this scene, they're eating frozen bloodworms. The bloodworms and frozen brine shrimp will help to bring out the red in their fins, making them even more colorful. I feed my tiger barbs a diet that's high in protein because I'm conditioning them for breeding, and the extra protein will help to increase their egg production. However, the breeding method that I'm going to use is a little unconventional. The traditional way to breed tiger barbs is to remove a small group of males and females and spawn them in a separate tank, because tiger barbs will eat their own eggs as well as any fry that may happen to hatch from those eggs. So it's virtually impossible to breed them and raise their young in the same tank as the adults. And in order to keep the eggs from being eaten right after they're laid, tiger barbs are typically spawned over a layer of marbles or in a basket with holes in the bottom that will allow the eggs to drop through the holes in the bottom of the basket, where they'll then be out of the reach of the hungry tiger barbs. Then, after a period of a day or two, the adults are removed from the breeding basket and returned to the main tank. However, in order to use this approach, I would first have to catch these tiger barbs, and in a heavily planted tank like this one, catching them would be very difficult without removing most of the plants and the driftwood. So I decided to use a much more simple approach, which has worked quite well for me in the past when I was breeding killifish. I've placed a thick layer of a plant known as SUSSWASSERTANG on top of the sand substrate, thinking that the barbs would drop their eggs in the SUSSWASSERTANG, and then I could periodically remove the plant along with any eggs that were attached to it. I could then place the egg-laden SUSSWASSERTANG in a 10-gallon tank along with 10 gallons of water from the main tank until the eggs hatched. Knowing full well that many of the eggs would be eaten before I got to them, but I also assumed that many of the eggs would be overlooked by the hungry tiger barbs, so I would still be able to get some fry. And every time I removed the thick layer of SUSSWASSERTANG, I would replace it with more, so that the tiger barbs would always have a plant to spawn in, and every week or two I could remove it and replace it with a new layer. I love this plant, and I think there's some in nearly every tank that I own. It doesn't send roots into the substrate, so it comes right out of the tank without creating a big mess. I wasn't sure that this unconventional method would work, but it seemed to be the simplest and most natural approach to breeding tiger barbs in a densely planted tank. And with this approach, I didn't have to catch the fish and put them in a separate tank or figure out which ones were males and which ones were females. All I had to do was give them lots of protein, keep the water warm and clean, and then periodically remove the plant and place it in a separate tank so that the eggs could develop and hatch in a safe environment. I knew that I probably wouldn't get a lot of fry using this technique, but I'm not a wholesale breeder, so I didn't need, nor would I have the room for, hundreds of baby tiger barbs. I looked every day for any signs of eggs or fry. Unfortunately, tiger barb eggs are very small, and I was never able to find any in the SUSSWASSERTANG. I knew from my research that it normally takes about 2 to 3 days for their eggs to hatch, and after about the 3rd day of incubation and still seeing nothing, I was beginning to think that this method was going to be a complete failure. And then, on the 4th day, I started to see a couple of very tiny fry clinging to the glass. They were unusual in that they didn't wriggle at all, and they looked like little tiny slivers of wood rather than fish. They still had a small yolk sac and were not free swimming quite yet. Unfortunately, every time I had the camera out and tried to film them, they were nowhere to be seen. Still, I was quite pleased to know that this method worked and that there were fry in there somewhere using up their yolk sacs and preparing to swim around the tank. Eager to see just how many fry I had, I carefully removed most of the SUSSWASSERTANG, and that's when more and more fry became visible. The baby tiger barbs seen here are about 6 days old, and at the moment they're feeding on baby brine shrimp. As you watch this footage, be sure to notice how these little tiger barbs capture their prey. This method of feeding is known as inertial suction. Simply put, they ingest their food by rapidly expanding their mouth cavity, which sucks the prey into their mouth. This feeding style is widespread amongst many fish species, both as juveniles and as adults. Also, be sure to notice this area right here. You might be inclined to think that this is the tiger barb's stomach. However, they don't have a stomach, just a really long intestinal tract, and those squiggly little lines that you see are its intestines. And these two things right here are its swim bladder. The swim bladder contains 2 air bubbles that enable the fish to control its buoyancy so that it can remain suspended in the water column without having to constantly use its fins to keep itself from sinking to the bottom of the tank. Baby brine shrimp don't have a swim bladder, so they have to keep swimming or they'll sink. Here's the same fry at 9 days old, and they're starting to get a bit more color now. At just 11 days old, their stripes are starting to become more and more noticeable, and their activity level has increased a lot. And by the way, the only reason I use a substrate in the fry tank is to keep the fry above the bottom rim of the aquarium so that I can film them more easily. Otherwise, I prefer not to use a substrate in my fry tanks because a bare bottom makes the aquarium much easier to keep clean. Clean, warm water and lots of live food will keep the fry healthy and help them grow quickly. And at this stage of their development, I'm feeding them 2 to 3 times per day with live baby brine shrimp and microworms. And here they are at 2 weeks old. Using lots of live plants helps to process the waste products produced by the fish, and one of my favorite plants to use is a floating plant called FROGBIT. I also like to have ram's horn snails in the nursery tank to help clean up any mess and leftover food. I only get about 15 to 20 fry each time I use this spawning method, but that's enough for me to bring to my local pet store where they give me store credit. I then let the store credit accumulate until I need something new, and then I use that store credit to get pretty much anything I want. I recently got 6 Hillstream loaches from breeding bristlenose plecos and tiger barbs. Here are the same fry at 3 weeks old doing something that I've never seen them do before. They're swimming upside down to feed on the bottom of these FROGBIT leaves. I'm not sure what they're eating. It could be baby brine shrimp or possibly infusoria. Nonetheless, it was not something that I expected to see, and I'm glad that I was able to capture it on film so that I could share it with you. Here are the same fry at 1 month old feeding on a carnivore pellet. They're starting to get a bit more aggressive now, and the reddish-orange coloration in their fins is just starting to show. Here they are again at 1.5 months of age, and they're really starting to look like miniature versions of their parents. The red in their fins is now much more obvious, and in another month or so, I'll be able to sell them to my local shop for store credit so that I can feed my insatiable thirst for all things aquatic. Now, before I bring this video to a close, there are a few important things that I'd like to mention. First of all, 22 tiger barbs in a 29-gallon tank is not something that I would recommend to everyone. However, I've been keeping fish for a very long time, and all of my tanks are kept in tip-top condition. The tiger barbs are the only fish in the tank. I'm very careful not to overfeed my fish, and I use a dense growth of plants to help me maintain excellent water quality. I test my water parameters every week, and I keep a close eye on all of the fish in my care. They seem happy and they breed regularly. And regardless of how you choose to keep and breed your tiger barbs, here are some of the more important things that you'll need to know before you start. 1. Tiger barbs are egg scatterers, so they don't release their eggs in one location but spread them around the tank. 2. Tiger barbs are trickle spawners, which means that when the females spawn, they don't release all of their eggs at once, but spawn repeatedly over the course of several days, releasing some of their eggs each day. And tiger barbs, like many other fish species, typically spawn in the morning just after sunrise. And 3. Tiger barbs spawn over vegetation and have adhesive eggs that stick to the vegetation until they're ready to hatch, which takes about 2 to 3 days at 78 degrees. So if you breed them using the basket method, be sure to put some Java moss or SUSSWASSERTANG in the basket to encourage them to lay their eggs. And when you remove the fish and the basket, be sure to put the moss in the tank with the eggs because there will be eggs attached to the vegetation. And my final bit of advice is that these fish can wreak havoc in a community tank, but they're fun to watch. So if you want to keep them in your home, buy a group of 10 or more and keep them in a tank devoted just to them. And in the long run, this single species approach will save you a lot of time, trouble, and heartache. And that brings us to the end of this video. Please help support my effort to continue bringing you these high-quality documentaries by sending vast sums of money to my PayPal account. And if that's a bit too much to ask, you could always hit the like button, subscribe, or leave a comment down below. However, that won't be nearly as effective as cash. Thanks for watching and have a beautiful day.